Medical workers at Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? Nurse, in hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor. Coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part. So the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine. And she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I'm haunted. But not in a bad way. I work as a PA for a clinic, so I'll never be involved in that situation, but I know a friend who has been. She is also a PA and was helping a guy who was terminally ill. Before he passed, he asked her to not let his wife have his tea. Of course she listens and is sympathetic. A day or so after he passed, his ex-wife apparently shows up to the hospital with several kids saying she is in this guy's will. Long story short, she was trying to take his tea. Having surgery tomorrow. What the FCK am I doing here? Edit. You are all super kind, wonderful people, and I will almost certainly not haunt any of you if I kick the bucket tomorrow. Edit 2. Surgery went well. I am home and resting. For the record, my not final words were as follows. Anesthesiologist. We're giving you the anesthesia now, you'll be asleep in just a few seconds. Me, stoned on the don't panic drug cocktail. Okay. Sweet dreams, honey. Everyone else in operating room. Ha 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 ha. So I went under to the sound of laughter. Not a bad deal at all. Again. Thank you all for your kind words and encouragement. Xanax has entered the chat. As a pediatrician, I don't hear a lot of last words. What I can never forget is the inconsolable, grief-stricken cries of the parents when I tell them their child has passed away. I'm a medical worker, but this is just a personal story about when my dad passed. He had pancreatic cancer and had a mild seizure the night before. The doctor came in to assess him and asked him a few questions. He couldn't remember what year it was. His name. Nothing. The doctor turned and pointed at me and said, "Who's that?" Full stop. My dad confidently replied, "That's my baby girl. Joel has no username." He went silent after that. Coded a bit later. And died the next day. He couldn't remember anything but that I was his daughter. And those were his last words. Nursing home. Most elderly people are at ease as they get nearer and nearer to death. But this old lady, as she deteriorated over her last week or so, would scream, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." Really heartbreaking to see. 4-year-old told her mother, "I'm ready. I still cry like a baby." It's not words that haunt me. It's the last few agonal breaths, gasping and gurgling, before they are gone. I still remember the first patient I lost as we stood by as per patient family request. Haunting. This is the same for me. Saw my share of people die in Afghanistan and rarely can they speak to have last words. Just choking on blood. It's how they look at you when they realize they can't talk. A mix of confusion and fear. Still haunts me. My uncle was born with Down syndrome. He was 42 when he died but had the mind of a 3-ish-year-old. He could do things like brush his teeth, dress himself, etc. but needed prompting and supervision. IGMA. His mother died in 1974. My uncle died in 1984. The night before he died, he told all of us that Mama came to see me last night. My dad asked him if he had a dream about Mama. He said no. She sat on my bed with me and told me she was coming to get me soon and take me home with her and not to be scared because it was all okay. We dismissed it. 24 hours later he was dead. He died peacefully in his sleep. Thanks for the award. I'm new so I don't know what it means yet, but AWW. Student sir. Are you in any pain? Patient the FCK kind of dumbest question is that I just got F-king stabbed. FCK yo I'm in pain. He died within minutes. I was visiting my grandpa and had to leave town and go back to medical school. And I told him I loved him and would see him later. He told me he loved me too. But no I wouldn't. He was right. He died a week later of pneumonia. I'm going home tonight. So I won't see you tomorrow. Bye. When I was training I had a guy go into a massive cardiac arrest. We ended up working on him for over an hour and a half because we kept getting him back then losing him again. He had wet himself during the arrest, which is common. It happens, and he just kept apologizing for making a mess. Had a patient that kept coding. But every time they came back they'd get crazy strong. Fight everyone. And then start saying the Lord's Prayer. They'd trail off and code again. Another one snatched me by the arm and pleaded that they wanted to see their baby grow up. 60 seconds later I was pumping away on their chest. In my line of work I hear a lot of last words. These two though surprisingly weren't the final last words. I just thought they were, and at the time it was a perfectly rational thought. Of last words my favorites were always the I want you to go away and leave me alone. I'm going to sleep. Goodbye. Family members didn't pick up on that one. But that patient and his eyes said it all. Edit. I'm an EMT. Had a patient say I don't feel so good right before they dropped dead of a massive heart attack. It was just the matter of fact way they said it. With wide eyes. Don't listen to my family. They want to keep me around forever but I just want to die. They won't let me. Edit. Not my patient but a friend of mine. He had a patent with a AAA, abdominal aortic aneurysm. Your aorta is bulging and throbbing about ready to pop. The pain is very severe and agonizing, and if it does rupture the pain immediately goes away and feels so good, but your chances of survival are pretty much non-existent even if you are prepped on the operating table when it ruptures. Anyways, he had a 15-year-old with one, and on the way to the hospital she looks at him and just says oh that feels so much better, and died about 10 seconds later. Both my parents work ER. So every time I say bye to anyone I love, I tell them I love them in case those are my last words to them. I don't feel sad or morbid about it. It's just that so many people regret not telling their special people how special they are when they had the chances. Paramedic here. I was transporting a cardiac patient, and while we were both watching my EKG monitor, he went into fib. A lethal heart rhythm. His heart stopped pumping blood effectively at that point, but there was enough blood pressure for a few seconds of consciousness. He looked at me and said, "But I don't see the light," and went unconscious. Coded him. Shocked him a few times. Meds by the handful. But he died. RN here. I don't remember this guy's admitting diagnosis. He wasn't assigned to me. But my co-worker asked me to help start an IV on him. He needed a unit of blood and his peripheral access had gone bad. I placed a tourniquet and was ready to stick. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm dying." Immediately went unresponsive. I checked his pupils. I watched one dilate and the other constrict. We coded him. Never got him back. As a former EMT, I can't count the number of people who said or screamed "I am dying" in the back of the ambulance. But I always could tell by the look in the eyes of the ones who really knew it and were not just panicking. Not in the medical field. But when my grandmother was in the hospital with kidney failure and dementia, I went to visit about a week before she passed. After we heard the news and flew out, the nurse informed us of an exchange they had had the night of. "How are you doing, Mary Lee? Is there anything you want to do tomorrow?" "Oh. No. I believe I'm going to go see my mama tonight. She died a few hours later." "You tell that man to get out of here right now," she screamed while staring behind me. Eyes sharp and focused on something. Me. In the middle of the night. while I was working the haunted hall. By myself. All of the heebies. And most of the jeebies. I see the man in the corner again. Semicolon. There was no one but she'd been seeing a dark man in the corner for days and asking about him. Toward the end. This was all she talked about beside crying for her mother. Cancer. Can I smoke in here? We were on an ambulance. Wasn't his last words. But last words he said to me. Semicolon. I am an EMT. And we had a frequent patient. Almost once a week. He was a huge dick. But towards the end he turned into a sweet and appreciative man. We were in his house. Which what ended up being our last day there. He knew it. I didn't. He said, can I just have a beer before we leave for the hospital? I didn't let him have it. I should have. One of my co-residents snuck a beer into the hospital for a dying 9-year-old kid. He was clearly on the way out and said, I'm sad I never got old enough to have a beer, so my friend snuck one in and gave the kid like half of it. He enjoyed it. Not the very last words. But I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears, but no. She just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. Don't let my mom come in. I don't want she to see me crying. She was 16. I wasn't prepared for that. Got broke like glass. I'm not a medical worker, but on the 28th of February this year we had a bad ice storm in Oklahoma. I had no choice but to go into work, and I worked 45 miles from home. The roads were awful and a solid sheet of ice. I witnessed a car accident. A double tractor trailer semi versus a Ford Focus. I had to stop because of it and I ran slid to her immediately. My dad is a retired firefighter EMT and my mom is a nurse, so I wanted to try to help if I could. When I got to her, she was hanging out of the driver's side window and the back of her head on one side was missing. When I went to feel for a pulse on her wrist, she grabbed me. Even though she was unconscious. She was gurgling and wheezing. I stayed and held her as she died. I listened to the gurgling and begged her to open her eyes, and she wasn't alone. That was the worst thing I heard. Her gurgling and death rattling. Sweet guy in his 20s with endocarditis, heart valve infection, caused by IV drug abuse. I was prepping him for his third open heart surgery when he sat up, looked me in the eye, and said, I'm going to die. I'll die? He did not survive the surgery. Not a healthcare worker, but my grandfather passed this week at 89 years old. He was a very sharp, sane man. Not senile or any dementia. The 2 days leading to his passing he began to see things. He told me, do you see Michelangelo painting? I said no. He said, he's painting invisible dust. Everything he paints disappears. I hope the bathroom is still there. He also told us he could see little men jumping from the fan blades. It was really strange. It sounded like he was tripping acid, but obviously he wasn't. He prayed over and over the night before he passed. We found him deceased in the morning. Not a medic. My friend's brother committed suicide. He hung himself in his closet while she watched TV in the living room. The last thing he said before going upstairs was, I'm going to rest. That weirded her out because he never spoke like that. I'm an intern at a home for patients with Alzheimer and have only been there for a few weeks. The first patient to pass during my internship said, so who am I? A teenage girl who was having an asthma attack while she was at someone's house she wasn't supposed to be at. My mom's gonna kill me. She died at the hospital. Not a medical worker, but I knew a guy from middle school who had a degenerative disease and he knew he'd die young. It was New Year's Eve and he'd just gotten out of the hospital for the third time in a few months, so we were partying at his apartment. Somehow I ended up being the last person there with him and his girlfriend, and we were pretty drunk and got to talking for a while about how great the party was. How much nice it was to have friends like ours. Plans for the future. All of a sudden he said, "God, I wish I had more time. I always thought I'd have more time." Not his last words, but they're the ones that stuck with me. We weren't close by any stretch, but I always wished he had more time too. He was so friendly and kind. The type of person who made you feel like their closest friend even if you were a total stranger. He was a good man and he deserved a longer life. RN here. We had a patient on our unit for a year almost. He was so mean. Thought we were always hurting him when we tried caring for him. Every interaction was very unpleasant. Well, I just had a bad breakup and was the world is ending depressed. The day he died he was calm and asked me if I was married. Which street the time made me kind of sad. So I just answered no, I'm not. And he just said, "You'll find someone. And I know you aren't trying to hurt me." It was so concise. To the point. And memorable for me. Honestly, it was me sweetest thing he could have said to me, and given the scenario I would say it was the sweetest thing anyone has said. On his deathbed. No formalities. Just telling me what he had always wanted to talk to me about. I cried when I left his room, and he passed away right at 7 PM when my shift ended. So I got to be with him. A family friend had a very young niece that was dying from cancer. Her parents were there to comfort her in the final hours. And one of the last things she asked was, "How do I die?" Full stop. Not a medical worker. But my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemo and one surgery, and overall his prognoses looked really good. He'd gone through another surgery. And he was due to be released from the hospital a couple days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room. He said, "I'm going to miss you, my love," and obviously she thinks nothing of it. Saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." Couple hours later he was gone. Hospice nurse here had a patient who was experiencing terminal agitation. With an expression of complete terror on his face he said, "Help me. They are coming to get me." Thank you from a little old man with stage 4 lung cancer. He had no family, so I stayed after my shift ended. He just didn't want to die alone and I refused to let it happen. Don't know why, but it still makes me cry when I think of it. Edit. Thank you for the golden kind words, fellow redditors. I very much appreciate it. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy, spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then. And I didn't show any signs either. It wasn't words. But the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR. Through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle. And her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed. And a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. My pop died of lung cancer. The last lucid thing he did was wake up just long enough to sing "Show Me the Way to Go Home." I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. It was really pretty amazing and freaky at the same time. FCK cancer. Edit. Wow, my first gold. Thanks for the glitter and all the kind words. My sincerest condolences to everyone who has lost someone to this horrible disease. Dad was over 80 and had smoked for a lot of his life. I still miss him, but he lived a long life and his time had come. I've lost a couple of friends who are my age to cancer, and those deaths are much harder to accept. He was a foot soldier in World War II and he sang that song while marching through Germany, I believe. I'm gonna FCK y'all up, old man who never attended his dialysis appointments. A few hours later we had a fire right by his former room. So despite not being all that worrying at the time, he definitely was the only one that followed through on actually haunting us.